without further ado, I will tell you a little bit about the cognitive science of fake news. And I should say that although I'm currently a professor at Yale, I'm moving to MIT this summer. So looking forward to getting to know the locals. Okay, so if I'm going to talk about fake news, I feel like something that has come up a lot already in this conference is potential issues related to this word and what it means. And so to define it for my purposes, I'm talking about stories that are purposely fabricated and presented as if from legitimate sources for whatever that end be that making money or political influence or fun or whatever. And the sort of two questions that I'm going to try and think about from an experimental social science and sort of cognitive science perspective is, first of all, why is it that people believe patently false stories? And then second of all, what might we be able to do to sort of fight the belief in and sharing of fake news and misinformation more generally? So starting with the first question about why it is that people believe these stories that seem pretty obviously not true, the dominant explanation in a lot of the media coverage, and I think in the academic literature, is things of the flavor of, the real story about fake news is partisanship, or this article won't change your mind, the facts and why facts alone can't fight false beliefs, and then this sort of, Dan Kahan, who's a law professor at Yale, is the one that's sort of most associated with the academic version of this, which is called identity protective cognition. And the idea here is it's a sort of pessimistic view of human reasoning, which basically says we use our reasoning abilities to justify the beliefs we already have or entrench those existing beliefs. And so the reason people believe fake news is essentially because they want to, they have some motivation to do so, and instead of using their powers to figure out what's going on, they just use their powers to selectively convince yourself of things that you already want to believe. And lots of people have said this, but there hasn't really been much empirical investigation of did it actually seem like this is happening. And it's not the only possibility. There's a more optimistic prediction also, which is that reasoning, optimistic at least with respect to our cognitive faculties, which suggests that reason is not just used to justify existing beliefs, but reason really is used to inform our beliefs and update and to try and figure out what's true. And so by this explanation, reasoning isn't the problem with fake news, it's lack of reasoning. That basically when people aren't figuring out, or when people are falling for fake news, it's because they're not thinking carefully about what's going on. And if they would think more, they could figure it out. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some cognitive science style experiments trying to differentiate between these two accounts. And the way we differentiate between them is by looking at competing predictions. So in particular, these two accounts make different predictions about what the relationship should be between how good an individual is at engaging in analytic thinking and how good they are at discerning the difference between fake and real headlines. And see why, for headlines that are politically discordant, that is, that don't align with your ideology, there's no motivation to believe them, and so regardless of which account you are thinking about, you would probably expect that people that are better at analytic thinking are better at differentiating between fake and real because there's no motivation. But for stories that are politically concordant, that align with your ideology, here, the optimistic view, which just says people use reason to figure out what's going on, says it should still be the case that if you are better at analytic thinking, you're better at telling fake from real, whereas this kind of pessimistic, motivated reasoning type account says here, you do have a motivation to believe these stories because they align with your ideology, and so here, people that engage in more analytic thinking should actually be worse at differentiating between fake and real because they're better at convincing themselves the fake stories are actually true. So we can test these predictions by running an experiment where we assess how good people are at analytic thinking and then show them a bunch of headlines and have them see how good they are at discerning fake from real content. And so we've run a lot of these experiments at this point. And this result is quite robust. I'm just going to tell you about one particular example, but there are many. So in this study, we recruited 800 survey participants We recruited them from Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is this online labor market that allows you to recruit people from all over the country. It's not nationally representative, but I feel like in the context of fake news consumption, it's not clear who the representative fake news consumers are, and it could well be that people that spend lots of time on the internet doing surveys are more representative of people that spend lots of time on social media sharing fake news than the national representative survey. And for people that are up on the whole replication crisis in experimental social science, everything that I'm going to show you is all pre-registered. Okay, so what they do in these experiments is in this one they read 30 headlines that are presented in Facebook format. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. Half of them are true, taken from just normal mainstream media outlets, and half of them are false as diagnosed by Snopes or factcheck.org. So they're balanced 50-50 on true-false, and then they're also balanced on partisanship, so half of them are sort of good for the Democrats or bad for the Republicans, half of them are politically neutral, and half of them are good for the Republicans or bad for the Democrats, as determined by a pretest where we showed all these headlines to another set of subjects and said, if this was true, how good would it be for the Democrats versus Republicans? So as an example, here's a story, Mike Pence, gay conversion therapy saved my marriage. This is a screenshot from the study. This is something that subject said, if it was true, it would be bad for the Republicans. And so they read it, and then they rate, to the best of your knowledge, how accurate is the claim in the above headline, and would you consider this sharing this story online? Here's one that was deemed good for the Republicans. So Obama was going to go to Castro's funeral until Trump told him this. Both of those are not true. So we saw a bunch of them. Half were like this, and half were actually true statements. And then we had them complete the standard measure of analytic thinking. It's called the cognitive reflection test, and it's a set of math problems that have intuitively compelling but incorrect answers. A paradigmatic example is a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If you're like most people, 10 cents is the first thing that pops into your head. So you might write down 10 cents, or you might stop and think about it in a second and be like, well, if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more, that means the bat would cost $1.10, which means together they would cost $1.20. So 10 cents is not actually the right answer, it's 5 cents. And some of them involve a little bit of math like this, some of them don't involve any math at all. And then we just score and say how many correct answers did people get. The more correct answers, the more deliberative they are, or the more sort of analytic thinking we're going to say they engage in. And just as a side note, this does look like a sort of stable individual difference measure of cognitive style. We saw that people's score on the CRT was correlated with an R of like 0.75 even when the two measurements were separated by more than 2 years. Okay, so the key question then is for each person, we know what their cognitive reflection test score is, and for each person we can calculate their media truth discernment score, which is the average accuracy ratings they gave to the real headlines minus the average accuracy ratings they gave to the fake headlines. We're going to now sort of be able to evaluate these competing predictions. Again, both accounts are sort of in agreement for headlines that are politically discordant, where there's no motivation to believe it. In both cases, just based on your basic understanding of reasoning, it should be the people that are more analytic are better at discerning fake from real. And so to get at that, I'm going to contrast people that say they preferred Trump over Clinton, seeing stories that are good for the Democrats, and people that say they prefer Clinton over Trump, reading stories that were good for the Republicans. And this was run about a year ago when Trump versus Clinton was a very salient difference. And on the x-axis, you have the participants' CRT score, where 0 is they got them all wrong, and 1 is they got them all right. And on the y-axis, this is their level of discernment. So 0 means they think that the fake and real are equally accurate, and 1 would mean they thought every fake story was totally inaccurate and every true story was totally accurate. And the size of the dot is proportional to the number of people that had each of those different sort of CRT scores. And what you see, both for Trump supporters rating pro-Democrat stories and for Clinton supporters rating pro-Republican stories, there's significant positive correlations, as you would expect, where basically people that are more analytic are better at telling what's going Okay, so now the interesting case is, so yeah, we have support for this not interesting prediction in that it was shared across both accounts. And so the more interesting case is, what about headlines that you have a motivation to believe because they align with your ideology? Again, the optimistic account says still better thinkers should do better, and the pessimistic says, well, the better thinkers are going to do worse at differentiating because they're going to be seduced into tricking themselves to think that the fake stories are real. And so now we're going to look at Trump supporters rating stories that are good for the Republicans, or Clinton supporters rating stories that are good for the Democrats. And what you see is exactly the same pattern as before, of anything a little bit stronger, where the better someone is at reasoning, the better they are at differentiating fake from real. Also, a little side note that you might notice is that the Clinton supporters are doing better than the Trump supporters, regardless of how well they are, but particularly the sort of high analytic ones. That's just a side note. But so what this means is that this is clearly consistent with this sort of more optimistic view that analytic thinking helps you figure out what's going on even when there's a motivation to do so, and is really not consistent with this pessimistic motivated reasoning account. And I should say that you get the same results as if instead of comparing Clinton versus Trump, you do Democrats versus Republicans or liberals versus conservatives. You also get equivalent results if you look at likelihood of sharing online rather than accuracy judgments. So and this is hypothetical likelihood of sharing. We just, in response to this, how likely would you be to share it? So what this suggests is that this account of saying, well, the reason people believe fake news is just because they want to, doesn't actually seem to be right. And it suggests that discernment isn't a lost cause, which I feel like is a lot of the feeling that I at least take away from that partisan motivated reasoning account. And instead it suggests that falling for fake news is more about inattention than it is about willful ignorance. And so the question then is, okay, what can actually be done in order to fight fake news? And I'm going to talk about a couple of proposals that make sense in light of the idea of falling for fake news resulting from inattention. But first, I'm just going to start with a little analysis of what had been Facebook's primary response, at least primarily a visible response, which is adding these disputed by third-party fact-checker warnings to headlines that had been disputed by third-party fact-checkers. And it makes it's a lot of intuitive sense that this should be a good approach, but there are some fundamental problems, which is that it's much harder to fact-check stories than it is to create fake stories. And so there's just no way that fact-checkers are ever possibly going to be able to keep up. And so that means that many, if not most, false stories are never going to wind up getting flagged, just because there's no way to keep up. And even for the stories that do wind up getting flagged, there's a lag in which the fact-checkers have to be doing the research and figuring out what's going on and noticing that this is a story they should be checking. And so it's slow. The leaked Facebook memo suggested it was on average about 3 days between when a story appeared and when it got flagged. And so that means during sort of peak virality, peak spreading phase for new pieces of false information, they're not going to have the tag. And so that might make you say, well, okay, so that means it's not a great solution just because it's incomplete. But there's actually a reason that this sort of inability to tag things effectively could make this actually worse than nothing, which is the following idea. So we ran this experiment where we actually ran 5 different experiments, and this is all of the results aggregated, where there's a control condition where they rate fake and true headlines, and there's no warning anywhere. And in the control, half of the fake stories are tagged with the disputed warning, and half of them aren't. And what I'm going to show you here is the fraction of the stories that are judged as accurate. And what you see is the fake stories that have the disputed warning on them are about 3 percentage points less likely to be seen as accurate. So there is a warning effect. Putting a warning on something does make people believe it a little bit less. But the question is, what happens for the stories that don't get a warning on it? And this is something we're calling an implied truth effect, where there's actually a bit of an increase in people's accuracy judgments of fake stories that don't have a tag, because people make the assumption that, well, if some stories have tags on them, that kind of means if it doesn't have a tag, then it probably was verified. And in our full sample, that implied truth effect isn't that big, but if you look at some samples of the population that are particularly bad at detecting fake news, that have a higher base rate of believing fake news, such as Trump supporters, there the implied truth effect is bigger, and it's almost the same size as the warning effect. And amongst young people, like 18 to 25-year-olds who are particularly likely to fall for fake news, there the implied truth effect is even bigger than the warning effect. And so that suggests that using fact checkers to flag disputed stories is probably not a great solution to this problem, and might even make things worse. And in response to this research and other external and internal research, Facebook actually got rid of that warning flag policy in December, which was cool. It's nice to see that they are, that they're listening and iterating. And then the next thing that they proposed was that they were going to start surveying users to determine the trustworthiness of news sites, and then up or down rank sources based on their trust ratings. And the reason this seems like it might be a good idea is because you're just rating outlets instead of individual headlines, it's much easier to keep up, because you only have to keep up with the creation of new outlets, not continual creation of new stories. And because you're crowdsourcing it rather than relying on experts, A, it's faster because it's easy to assemble a big crowd. You don't have to only rely on trained fact checkers. And B, you might be able to avoid concerns of liberal bias, or the appearance of liberal bias that come with fact checking. So I think Facebook was like, oh great, we got this great idea, it's gonna be awesome. And as you may guess or remember from when this was announced in January, the response was not wildly enthusiastic. There were lots of pieces about how this was really a terrible idea. And all of these different complaints basically boiled down to the following set of arguments. The first one was concerns about partisan bias. So if it's the case that people are engaged, as everybody sort of thinks, in lots of motivated reasoning around media consumption, then the sources that people are going to trust most are going to just be the ones that validate their political beliefs, and that means that the outlets that are going to do best are not the ones that are most reliable, but actually the ones that are most partisan. And then the other concern is that social media users are like not experts. Just your random Facebook user is not an expert in telling what's fake or real. Probably they fall for fake news all the time, so why should they be able to figure out what's a good headline or not, what's a good outlet or not? And also probably they're not familiar with most of the outlets. So like, how should anyone be expected to have this work? But our research, from the first set of studies, was suggesting that there's not actually that much partisan bias. At least there is certainly disagreement, but there's not that much motivated reasoning going on. If people think about it, they're not actually that bad at telling what's fake versus real, even though they're not really experts. And so actually, the genesis of this project was a reporter sent me an email being like, hey, what do you think about this new Facebook thing? I wrote this whole email about all the things that were terribly wrong with it, and then I realized, oh wait, it's an empirical question. Like, why don't we just run an experiment and find out? So that night, we built a survey and recruited 1,000 people the next day to take it and find out. And so what we did, again, they're from MTurk, and so they skew Democrat, and I'm going to split the Democrat versus Republican leaning ratings so you can look at partisanship. And we asked them using exactly the survey questions that Facebook said that they were going to use in their trust survey. We asked them to indicate their familiarity with each outlet and their trust in each outlet. And we had a set of 60 headlines, 20 of which were mainstream media outlets, 20 of which were hyper-partisan outlets like Breitbart or InfoWars or Daily Kos, that is, that report on mostly true events, but just with a super skewed reporting on it, and then sites that are mostly straight-up fake news. But the line between some of these things are always blurry. Like after we ran the experiment, some people said that these two and this one are maybe better considered hyperpartisan than fake. I know some question about whether Salon is really a mainstream outlet or is like a hyperpartisan left outlet, but by and large, it's pretty good. Particularly Breitbart, after it got published, Breitbart wrote about it, and as you can imagine, they didn't probably love this, and they said this revealed Facebook's liberal bias that we put Salon in the mainstream media list. Whatever. Okay, so the point is they rated each of these, and then we want to know how well are people doing. So what I'm going to show you is there's going to be one dot for each of the 60 outlets. On the x-axis, you see the average trust level among Democrats, and on the y-axis, you see the average trust level among Republicans. So down here is content that's trusted by neither Democrats nor Republicans. Up here is content or outlets that are trusted by both. Down here, they're trusted by Democrats, not Republicans, and up here, they're trusted by Republicans, not Democrats. Okay, so the big reveal. Here's what it looks like, which is you see all of the partisan bias, or let's see, all the partisan differences that people talk about, which is every single mainstream outlet is trusted more by the Democrats than the Republicans, except for Fox. And most of the hyperpartisan and fake sites are trusted more by the Republicans than by the Democrats. But the partisan differences are really small compared to just overall a massive difference that people know the difference between a real news outlet and a non-credible, non-reliable outlet. And so if you just say, what would be the average rating combining Democrats and Republicans, every single mainstream outlet does better than every single hyperpartisan and fake outlet, except for Salon, which does basically the same as Daily Wire and Daily Report, World News Daily Report. But again, Salon might actually have been better considered a hyperpartisan site anyways. So it actually does remarkably well. But a key point here is that in this plot, we're including all of the people who said, we're including ratings from people who said they were unfamiliar with a given outlet. And Facebook had said in their post that they were going to throw out the trust ratings from people that indicated they were unfamiliar with the source, because if you're unfamiliar with the source, how are you supposed to have anything meaningful to say about it? But that seemed like a bad idea, because not having heard of a source doesn't mean you have no information about it. Not knowing about it is actually a useful piece of information that probably is an unreliable site. Plus, if you think about it, there's a selection bias for who is familiar with fake news sites, predominantly people that like and believe fake news. And we actually find the people that say they're familiar with fake news sites do worse on the CRT, that cognitive reflection test. They're like less analytic thinkers, whereas people that are familiar with mainstream outlets are better analytic thinkers. And so if you throw out the ratings from the people that say they're unfamiliar, it looks a lot worse. And now it's like 35% of the mainstream outlets are getting beaten on average by hyperpartisan or fake outlets. And here you actually see this interesting difference between fake versus hyperpartisan sites, where the hyperpartisan sites are selectively good among the Republicans, whereas the straight up fake news sites are doing pretty well among both Democrats and Republicans that are familiar with them. And so, I feel like the key point here is people are actually a lot better at telling what's reliable and what's not than you might have thought. And this kind of crowdsourcing trust ratings doesn't actually seem like that bad of an idea. And you might ask how this squares with all of this reporting about people having no faith in the media anymore and there being lots of bias in ratings. And if you look at this picture, this is the one including all the ratings, you see all of those things there, which is, as I said, if you were to only look at the mainstream media outlets, which is what happens usually in these Pew surveys and stuff like that, there is this liberal bias where the liberals trust all of the outlets more than the conservatives. And also, the overall trust ratings are pretty low. Like, they're around 40 to 60% of the maximum. And so overall, trust ratings of the mainstream media outlets look low, but the point is they're still way better than the fake and hyperpartisan. So to the extent that you're trying to differentiate sort of legitimate outlets from non-reputable outlets, people are actually pretty good at doing that. Okay, and so then the last thing that I want to talk about is you could think of that as essentially an algorithmic solution in that it's about up and down ranking things, and you're just using, well, it is maybe a hybrid solution where you use human ratings to inform the ranking algorithm. But the last thing that we talk about is a straight up user interface type solution that is like a sort of purely behavioral or cognitive solution that doesn't have any algorithmic component to it. And the idea is that if it's the case, as our the first study that I was talking about indicated, that falling for fake news is more about inattention than about willful ignorance, then that suggests that you could get people to be better at discerning fake from real if you could get them to just pay more attention, and in particular to pay attention to accuracy. And so we ran the following experiment that attempted in a very sort of minimal way to make accuracy top of mind and see how that influenced their ratings. So in the control, they just see the headline and then they indicate how likely they would be to share it on Facebook. Again, 12 real, 12 fake, half good for the Democrats, half good for the Republicans. And then the treatment is exactly the same, but at the beginning of the study, before they do any of this, we just say, first, we'd like to pre-test an actual news headline from 2016 or 2017 for future studies. We're interested in whether people think it's accurate or not. We only need you to give your opinion about the accuracy of a single headline, then we'll continue on to the primary task. They just see one politically neutral headline, rate it for accuracy. Then we say, okay, great, thanks. Now go on, and they say how likely they would be to share these 24 headlines. And so now what I'm going to show you is the average likelihood of sharing for people in the control versus the treatment of fake versus real content. And what you see is that in the control, they're a little bit more likely to share real content than fake content, but not much different. Whereas in the treatment, just asking this one accuracy question at the beginning, it doesn't change their willingness to share real stuff at all, but it significantly reduces their willingness to share fake stuff. And it's on the order of, it increases their discernment by a factor of 2.5 or something like that. And we've run various different versions of this. It works for Trump supporters and Clinton supporters. It works for politically concordant headlines and politically discordant headlines. And we're about to roll out some field experiments on Twitter and on Facebook trying to do this sort of in the wild, basically popping up little surveys for people and being, hey, take this survey. How accurate do you think this question is? And then looking at how it impacts their subsequent sharing and liking and whatnot. We think if this works, this is something that would be very easy for Facebook to deploy, or Twitter or whoever, because basically what they could say is they have a very natural excuse for asking people periodically to give their opinions on the accuracy of headlines. We just say, help inform our algorithms. Like, here's this thing. How accurate do you think it is? We have, there's some hope that that could really lead people on their own, essentially, to say, do I think this is worth sharing or not? And the thing that's nice about this is it's distributed in the sense that it doesn't rely on a centralized authority to define what's fake and what's not fake, and it sort of relies on the fact that when people think about it, they're actually not bad at telling what's going on. It's just that people aren't usually thinking about it. And so same way, you don't need fact checkers to keep up with fake news, with the continual flow of fake stories, and it's basically zero cost. And the reason I think that we find people doing reasonably well at discerning in our studies, but they are not doing so great on social media or in our control where accuracy isn't brought up at all, is people's default thing when they're reading stories, even though at the end of the study, if you ask them how important is it to only share true content, basically people in both conditions say, so people in both conditions say that over 90% of people say it's very important to only share accurate content. So it's not that people are purposely sharing inaccurate content, they're just not thinking. And I feel like Facebook is designed to make you not think by mixing news headlines in with pictures of babies and dogs and stuff like that. And so it's pushing you into non-analytic thinking mode. And so we're hopeful that some little interventions like this to sort of nudge people in the direction of thinking about accuracy could be impactful. And just to finish with some caveats, as I said at the beginning, this is all run on Mechanical Turk. It's this non-representative sample, but again, not clear who really is representative. Another big thing is this is US participants only, and it's quite possible that in countries that have less of a tradition of a free press and stuff like that, and less experience judging the accuracy of basic principles of news accuracy, maybe this will work less well. We don't really know, but it would be good to test. You know, we did it in the context where we knew it was an experiment rather than in the field, and we only looked at, you know, some small subset of all possible headlines and outlets. So that's why trying to do field experiments is really important. And I'm also hopeful that, you know, Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that might try some of this stuff themselves where they can really reach inside the machine. So just to wrap it up, these results suggest that analytic thinking is used to inform, not justify beliefs, at least in the context of fake headlines and sources, and also hyperpartisan sources. Third-party fact-checking is slow, only results in partial coverage, and can lead to these implied truth effects. So it's not a great solution, at least in terms of labeling. It's still useful for informing the algorithms, but it's not going to be anywhere close to a full solution because it can't catch stuff until it's already gone viral, basically. Our crowdsourcing results suggest that this crowdsourcing of trust ratings for news outlets might actually be a pretty promising route. And finally, we also think that it could really be powerful to remind people about accuracy, given that it seems like most people really do only want to share content that's accurate. And all this work is done with my collaborator, Gordon Pennycook, who is a king among men, and these are some of the working papers that have resulted from it.
Can I ask you just sort of unplug and maybe step to the side?
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Questions while Harsh comes down and sets up. I know that Anya, who is doing a great deal of work on questions of truth accuracy and fact checking, is jumping out of her seat.
Oh, right.
Exactly. Well, I've been citing you all year, so I'm very excited to be in the same room as you. And I have two questions. The first one's just selfish, which is my students all think they're better at telling fake news than old people. So I was wondering what the source was of your assertion that of the 18 to 25 finding harder to distinguish.
Oh,
okay. Was that one of your
it's our
papers?
data.
Who falls for fake news? Or?
So that was, we consistently find that result in all of them.
All right, well, there's totally out from the horse's mouth. And then the other question I had was, I noticed that so many of these studies use control groups, and I'm wondering, this isn't a science experiment, it's not a drug trial. Is that actually a good method, control groups? I mean, I know it's all you've got, but do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, it's totally essential for everything.
But, I mean, how do you but no, what I'm saying is the placebo headlines, right? If you give someone a fake headline, could you not influence them in some way or affect them in some way?
So to clarify, the control, so we're always showing people like real fake headlines or real true headlines. And the control group thing is about in studies where we do interventions, like in one where we expose them.
So you're not giving people fake headlines? Because Alcott and Genskamp did that in their study,
Yeah,
and I
that
thought
I
that
don't
was highly problematic.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not doing that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right. So the only place that we use controls, the control is not a reference to stimuli, but to the absence or presence of the intervention.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead. You can see the audience better than
I don't know if you
for
would
a
like.
whole bunch of reasons.
I have a couple of questions about the design of the first set of studies.
Mhm.
So you decided to show just the just the headline and the picture, and it seemed like the choice of the news articles that you decided to show was like it's kind of clear, at least from the few examples you gave us, whether it's fake or not. But tell a little bit more about that decision. Like how did you decide why just the headline?
So the reason we did just the headline is there's some study that I don't remember the reference off the top of my head when we cited it in the paper. It says a large majority of people's engagement with news content online is just that much. And the number of people that actually click the headline and go and read it is pretty small.
Sure, does that translate to sharing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. In that study, although we talk about the sharing, we're predominantly focused on the beliefs, basically the accuracy assessments. And so it's like as you're scrolling through your headline, your newsfeed, you're reading all these headlines. Basically, are you believing them or not? Was the
And in terms of selecting the stimuli, we balanced them on partisanship. And we tried to pick fake stories that seemed like pretty representative of the kind of stuff that was on Snopes, and true stories that were not stories that everyone would already be familiar with. Because we weren't trying to say, do you know this already, but just here's a statement, what do you think about it? And like I said, that's one of the limitations, is we only looked at those particular studies, and so we would really like to do this on platforms where you can see a much bigger swath of things.
So we're going to stop here because we do have 2 other presentations. Fortunately, at the end of this, we have Grace and the opportunity to ask David more questions about methodology, which is the correct way to ask methodology questions. So,
I would love to talk to everybody that's interested, so let's do it.
yeah, so let's make sure we do